A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime Daily, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Everyone in the world of true crime has a story to tell about a case they worked or they lived through. Some are high profile, some you have never heard of, but they are all fascinating. Today's case is about one of the country's most notorious doctors, a physician who dispensed more addictive pills than any other doctor of his time. He is responsible for prescribing millions of opioid pills. The DEA called it the largest pill mill operation, which was an all-cash business in southern Ohio. Dr. Paul Vulgan is serving 4 life sentences for the overdose deaths of 4 of his patients. Our guest today is journalist Philip Isle, who has written a book about this pill-pushing doctor called Prescription for Pain, which will be out in April of 2024. Philip spent nearly 15 years researching this case. Philip, welcome to the program. It's such an honor to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
This case seems to me to fit into a discussion that we as a country are currently having. I feel like something changed almost 2 years ago, where news organizations were finally having a discussion as to who is responsible, especially when it comes to big pharmaceutical companies and doctors and the system and hospitals, to this addiction crisis that we have. A conversation, Philip, which I believe was not as easy to have at the time that this crisis was unfolding in our medical system.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, working on this project for so long, I've been working on it on and off since 2009. I saw how that conversation kind of developed, and I followed certainly the books that were being written. Now I'm just catching up on all of the TV shows about it, watching Dope Sick on Hulu and Painkiller on Netflix, and I have this long list of TV shows I want to make it through before my book tour, so I'm caught up on what everybody's watching. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to the level of doctors, which this case is about, there was impropriety of various kinds at numerous levels of the chain. Obviously, we all know the stories about Purdue Pharma and the pharmaceutical companies. There were the distributors that have been sued, the pharmacies. I was focusing on the level of doctors. And I think maybe one reason why this conversation has been slow to take place is there are a couple of reasons. One, it's not easy to investigate and convict a doctor of prescription drug dealing. It's nuanced. The law is subjective. There's a lot of leeway that a doctor can say, I was treating pain. It's hard to prove various aspects of that case. So there's one thing. And there's also, as the son of a physician and as somebody who goes to doctors and wants to trust doctors, I think we all have this kind of built-in resistance to hearing stories about criminal doctors because it's such a violation of trust and these people who we want to believe in and believe have our best interests. It's a very scary thing to learn about a doctor who didn't have his patient's best interest at heart and who was such a smart, qualified guy. I think to sit with those facts is very uncomfortable.
I think so, too. I agree that the system is not one that is transparent, but I believe early on that powerful pharmaceutical companies were so powerful that they shut down the early reporting on this. And I experienced that firsthand somewhere between 2006 and 2010. I don't remember the exact date. This was, again, at the beginning of the crisis where people are talking about how addictive this is and how it's ruining lives. And we're not having a conversation about this. And our attorneys were contacted as I'm doing this report for the NBC station at the time in Los Angeles, contacted by Purdue Pharma's huge legal team. And let me tell you that those conversations led to a very chilling effect on how far I could go with my reporting and what I could say, because they made it clear that they would be owning, the channel and everything else. Were there any errors or anything that they disputed. And their dispute was all just like this. It was all a distraction. It was all like, using all this power to suppress the information that was affecting people at the time. And that, to me, while may not be a legal crime, is a moral crime that then makes a perfect storm for this doctor to operate, and for a very long time.
Yeah. And, this book was not easy to write for a lot of reasons. There was a lot of research. It was difficult subject matter. I was grappling with this subject, Dr. Vulgan himself, for many years, first in in-person interviews and then via correspondence. I didn't think of it as easy, but when you talk about going up against the Purdue Pharmas of the world, maybe it was comparatively easy. I don't envy the job that Patrick Radden Keefe had, or that you had, to go up with these enormously powerful and, as you say, aggressive companies. I mean, it was hard enough as just a journalist facing off against a single man who has an MD, PhD, and feeling like I had the basis to dispute the things he was trying to say. That was hard enough. I'm glad that I didn't have to have those kind of legal conversations.
I just think that it really delayed this process until the crisis became such, and the revolt became so strong, and the voice is so strong, that now you have the unraveling of all of that. And I think that's why we're seeing the discussion now into what happened. And this is a case which I find so fascinating, because at the time that this happened, at the time of, the arrest, the trial, the conviction, even though it's the biggest case of its kind, I think most people still don't know about this case.
Yeah, I think I've certainly done my research. And when it comes to bad doctors, there have been a number of doctors who have become kind of household names in recent years, not necessarily for opiate-related reasons. We have Larry Nassar with the Olympic team scandal. We have, to a lesser extent, although I think a lot of people have heard of him, Conrad Murray, who was Michael Jackson's doctor. But for whatever reason, I don't think folks in maybe the general public, I'm not sure any of these, there have been so many of these cases of doctors convicted of prescription drug dealing during, let's say, the last 25 years. I'm not sure any of them have made their way into kind of household name status. In part because maybe there's so many of them. I mean, I live in Rhode Island, and we've had cases of this kind here. If you go to this area of Southern Ohio, which is right on the border of Kentucky, one of my first trips, I remember talking to a journalist, and he said, it's hard to remember all of them. There have been so many doctors. It was hard to keep track of just which one went to prison. So yeah, I do feel fortunate in that I'm telling a story that I think a lot of people maybe haven't heard of it, and I'm in a position where I can get them completely up to speed about that.
So Dr. Vulgan, I guess from 2003 to 2005 would have been the time that he was investigated and dispensed more oxycodone than any other physician in the country. And we're not just talking, just a little more. We're talking about millions more. One human being prescribing millions of pills in this all cash business. So I guess part of me is torn whether, we should talk about the crime as it is, meaning how he did it, how the clinics were set up, versus also the man, because, you've got a special connection to a degree to this doctor. And was that the reason you decided to investigate this case? Because your dad knew him.
Yes. We can start with the person and then get into the crimes. So I became interested in this story because of a personal connection. My dad, who is a very soft-spoken, polite, law-abiding physician here in Rhode Island, Massachusetts. I say in the book, I'm not sure I've even seen him get a speeding ticket. he went to college and medical school with Paul Volkmann. And in the book, I include some photos in the middle and an insert. And there's a photo of them from the University of Rochester in the 1960s where they really look similar. It's kind of eerie. They're both wearing a similar jacket and tie. They have these similar glasses, almost similar haircut. So they spent college at the University of Rochester, and then they both got MD PhDs at the University of Chicago, prestigious program. And then there's, of course, that MD PhD. So they were training to be medical researchers, which is also something I became interested in. So they were on these kind of parallel tracks for really 10 years. And then they mostly fell out of touch. Paul Volkmann was not a guy who was coming over to our house when I was growing up for barbecues. We didn't go on vacations with him. I had never heard of him until 2009, when the year prior, Paul had called my father out of the blue when his wife passed away. When Paul's wife passed away, he had asked a number of his former classmates to come to the funeral. And my parents, they were a bit thrown off by this out of the blue call from a guy they hadn't heard from, but they decided it was the right thing to do, and they went. And when they went to Chicago, they learned about Paul's legal situation.
So hold on, where was Paul? Okay, this is fascinating to me. He calls your parents to come to this funeral of his wife, a very sad thing, but where is he in his legal troubles? Has he been arrested already? Is he like...
So I guess one of the reasons I'm telling it from this perspective is I had a lot of the same questions you had. I didn't know any of this stuff. He had been indicted. He had been incarcerated for a period of time, but ultimately released pending his trial, partly because he successfully argued that his wife, who was gravely ill with a brain tumor at that point, needed somebody to help take care of her. And that was partly how he got out of prison pending his trial. So at the time that my parents went to this funeral and then came back and told me, it was post-indictment, pre-trial. And they didn't know much more about it. In fact, it didn't come up until about a year later when we were on a family trip and it came up in conversation. And this is 2009. I'm 23 years old. I'm just getting started as a journalist. I had read In Cold Blood recently, and that had made a huge impression on me. And all of a sudden, you know this, I'm sure, as a journalist, we always have our antenna out for stories. And usually they take more looking around than this. This story just fell into my lap. And of this guy with this remarkable resume being charged with these really horrific crimes of this massive years-long prescription drug dealing scheme, cash-only pain clinics, armed guards, numerous patients dying. So as I say in the book, I started out with these two facts in my head that really didn't make any sense. I knew that Paul, like my dad, had an MD PhD from the University of Chicago from 1975. And then my dad's knowledge and my knowledge at the start kind of went blank for the next 30 some odd years. And then he was indicted and charged by the federal government. And as a crime reporter, the federal government doesn't mess around. If you're federally indicted, you're in deep, deep trouble. They win the overwhelming majority of cases they bring. So Paul was federally indicted. And so these two facts didn't seem to make sense next to one another. And I set out to find out what happened in between. And ultimately, many, many years later, I have this book where I lay out what happened in his life, what happened in his medical career up to that point, and then what happened down in Ohio, and what happened after at the trial and the sentencing and so on.
That to me is so fascinating. And I agree with you. When you hear something like that, it's one of those, like, you say to your parents, why didn't you tell me this? Why am I finding this out now? This incredulous journalist is like, what?
Well, it turns out they did tell me early enough, but yes, I mean, that was, I don't know if I asked them, why didn't you tell me earlier? But immediately, I was about to enter a graduate writing program, and I have this diary entry from that day where I scribbled down, what I had just heard. And within a few months, as I moved to New York to start this graduate program, I sent a letter to Paul. I wrote him a short letter explaining who I was, that I was the son of his former classmate, that I was this young writer who was about to start a graduate program. And I said that I had found a little bit about his case online, but I wanted to hear his version of events. I was interested in writing about it, and would he be up for speaking to me? And I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't responded. Maybe I would have dropped the story. It might have been a tougher story to write without his participation. Not that I simply transcribed what he told me, because it turns out he's a deeply unreliable narrator. But I'll never know.
You mean he's a liar?
Yes.
Yes.
But I'll never know, because within about a week of me sending that letter, I get a random phone call, and it's him. And he says, yes, I'll speak to you. And so we made plans. And a few months later, during my vacation over the Christmas break, I drove out to Chicago in December 2009, and we had the first of a number of face-to-face interviews, during which I was recording with his permission. And he told me, I would say he told me everything, but he told me everything according to him, which is not quite everything.
Yes, that is fascinating. So I do want to get into a little bit. I want to get to the actual investigation, but I think, sure, you know, if I understand, because I read your article, I believe, was it for Cincinnati Magazine? Right.
In 2017, I wrote a magazine-length article that I think stands on its own. I think of it as kind of like a trailer for the book now, yes, because it's pretty long by magazine standards, but there's a lot more to the story that I get into in the book, including my own relationship, which developed with Paul over time.
So it seems like he had, you know, the normal course of a doctor making his way through practices, but because of a series of malpractice lawsuits, he ends up almost being unemployable because he couldn't get insurance. Yeah. And that leads him to these pain clinics. Is it true that he actually answered, was it an ad on Craigslist, or is that just in my brain?
That might be in your brain. I don't know the exact site where he found the ad. I do know it was online. And at this point, he would have been in his 50s, and he had this kind of odd and unusual collection of career experiences. He had started out in medical research, as he had been trained to do. Then he fizzled out from that for reasons that he claims are one thing and I found are another. He started out in pediatrics. That apparently wasn't making enough money for him. He expanded his practice to family medicine. He started working in local emergency rooms in Chicago. He was based in Chicago, even while he was working in Ohio later, which is another part of the story I can tell you about. But what wound up happening is he wound up finding a niche for over a decade as a kind of traveling emergency room medicine, taking what are called locum tenens jobs, which are temporary work for doctors. And in the course of 15, 20 years, he was sued a number of times. A couple of those cases went to trial and jury verdicts against him. A couple others were settled by his insurance companies, and he wound up uninsurable. And as you said, very close to unemployable medically. But at this moment in his career, when he was pretty desperate, he didn't use that word desperate, but I certainly think it applies. He was looking for a job and found an ad for a pain clinic in Southern Ohio, right on the Kentucky border, on the Ohio River, in a kind of where the Rust Belt meets Appalachia. Lovely part of the country, a part of the country I hadn't been to before, but certainly a part of the country that's pretty hard hit by, deindustrialization and already at that point prescription drug abuse. And the clinic didn't require any malpractice insurance. And
that should have been the first red flag.
Well,
if you were a good doctor, it's like, what do you mean you don't have the malpractice insurance? But this explains why, again, for him, this was a perfect storm that he was walking into. What I don't understand, Philip, is who owned these clinics? These were not doctors that owned the clinics. There was someone who worked in a shoelace factory.
I mean, so you mentioned red flags. Another red flag was who owned the clinic. I mean, I spoke to some jurors to flash forward. The woman who owned the clinic was named Denise Huffman. She had not gone to college, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on people that don't go to college, but if you're going to start a medical clinic where lots of prescriptions for opiates are being dispensed, I would hope you might have some medical training, but she didn't. She had worked in some fast food restaurants, worked in some local factories. Her main qualification, she said, for starting a pain clinic was that she had had a lot of injuries of her own over the years. Her family had a lot of chronic pain. And so she had, according to her, a lot of familiarity with the tribulations that pain patients go through to get the treatment they need. Now, if you talk to folks down in this part of Ohio, they would tell you that pain clinics of this kind, cash-only pain clinics that prescribe large amounts of opiates and other controlled substances, was a booming industry there. And a lot of doctors had kind of planted the seeds. They had been up and running. Some of them had gone to prison. So these folks will tell you that whatever Denise says about why she started the clinic was BS. She started it because this was a tried and true business model for an area that didn't have a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs, let's say. So Paul and Denise, who wound up being partners, are kind of an odd couple in terms of their professional partnership. You have this woman who dropped out of high school, who is from the Appalachian region, and you have this immaculately qualified MD PhD guy who is from the big city of Chicago, and they managed to make it work together as clinic owner and doctor for a few years. Paul was initially on a salary there. And the thing I was going to say about a juror is Denise was ultimately, along with her daughter who helped her run the clinic, she was indicted along with Paul. And she and her daughter pled guilty and testified at the trial. And one juror told me, after hearing Denise's, after the trial, he remembered hearing Denise's testimony, and he said, if I walked into a clinic and this woman was the owner, I would have walked right out. That was the kind of impression she gave.
So explain to me how the clinics operated. So there were a few of them, and they were all cash and took no insurance.
Correct. And they were cash only. They were not affiliated with any local hospitals, not affiliated with any local universities. And Paul Vulgan, while he was there, didn't really consult with many other doctors. He was kind of a lone wolf. They claimed to be legitimate medical establishments. Now, whether they did that with a wink to people, I spoke to people who were from this area, some people whose siblings went to the clinics. One woman whose sister passed away after going to one of Vulcan's clinics, and she said, everyone knew why you were there, and you just didn't talk about it. But this guise of legitimacy, however thin it was, allowed the people participating, the doctor, the owner, the patients, to all kind of go through the motions of legitimate pain care, except in pretty much all cases, they were being treated the same way, with heavy doses of opiates and muscle relaxers and anti-anxiety medication. Another factor about these clinics, which is kind of hard to believe, but is true, within a few months, local pharmacies started refusing to fill Vulcan's prescriptions. They said these are excessive, these are dangerous. They said patients were coming in groups. That was sketchy. They said that people were young. They didn't look like, a lot of these pharmacists testified at the trial. They said the people were young. They didn't look like they were in pain. And so one by one, they started refusing to fill the scripts. And what happened was the clinic, Paul and Denise's clinic, submitted a application to start their own on-site dispensary, basically an in-house pharmacy. And they got the green light to do that. So within a few months of his arrival down there in Southern Ohio, Volkman and Denise, his boss, the owner of the clinic, were running this one-stop shop, still all cash, but patients could see the doctor, receive a script, and then go down the hall and to this kind of thrown together pharmacy and walk out of the clinic with lots and lots of prescription medications.
Hundreds of pills, not like, a 30-day supply. We're talking about each person could walk out with hundreds and hundreds of pills.
Yes. And in my reporting and also in the trial transcript, you hear from family members of these patients who are really alarmed by what they're seeing and alarmed by the number of pills. One wife of a patient who passed away told me that the pill bottles were strikingly large, and she didn't understand why that was necessary. Another widow of a patient testified at the trial about counting, her husband's pills and thinking there's no way a person could take this many pills and be okay. And she called up the clinic to express her concerns before her husband passed away. And basically they hung up on her. And then after her husband died, she called the clinic again and basically said, I hold you responsible for this. And again, nothing came of it, except she eventually told that story in court.
Philip, is it your opinion, or was it at all proven to any point that the people who were buying these pills were consuming all of these pills, or were they consuming them and then selling the rest? Because that's an awful lot of pills.
I think it was a mix. I heard from a lot of people that it was kind of a perfect storm down there. This was an area, Scioto County in Ohio has long been one of the poorest counties in Ohio. They used to be a booming manufacturing town, like so many Rust Belt towns. They made shoes there, they made steel there, they made bricks there. But by the time that Volkman arrived, that stuff was long gone. And this was a really a place that had been really hard hit by the economic trends of the last few decades. So not only were people going, some had real pain and then became addicted, some were recreational users who were using, or what you hear from a lot of folks who have struggled with opiate addiction is you're not really trying to get high at a certain point, you're just trying not to get dope sick withdrawal. But for a lot of folks you heard about, this was a black market economy where they were selling and making money in a way that wasn't available necessarily because this was such a hard hit economic place. So it was definitely these pain clinics were to some extent an economic engine for the black market down there, as well as a distribution center for pills that were abused.
So the pharmacies in the area refused to, fill these prescriptions anymore, and they start doing it themselves. So it's, one-stop shopping here, all cash. That there were complaints to medical boards, to local authorities, to the DEA. So what took so long? Because I'm also stunned by how you can be rated by the DEA to be warned, because usually when these things happen, the federal government is very good about warning you, especially when it comes to either a medical malpractice situation. They let you know, it's like, so we're watching you. Yeah. And yet, unfazed, continued with business.
Yeah, I never really got a satisfactory answer to the what took so long question.
And that is the heart of it. See, this is what I believe, Philip. The fact that you have been working on this for, 15 years, and you're still searching for that satisfactory answer that lives within the system proves that the system is part of the problem as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Well, so I will say a few things. I did speak to a prosecutor at one point who told me that this area was a bit understaffed as far as the DEA went, that the local nearest office was a bit further away, and that it was simply hard to get coverage down there.
Philip.
Well, but I will say, I want to tip my hat to Randy Ludlow, a retired reporter at the Columbus Dispatch, who, I mean, the case up to the point where I started writing about it hadn't been covered in depth, but Randy had gone into the most depth. He wrote a feature piece for the paper when Vulgan was indicted. And the headline of that piece, which I'll never forget because it was one of the first pieces I read, the headline read, "More died as 3-year probe unfolded." And Randy, in that article, it's definitely about what Vulcan did, but not so subtly. It's about asking what took so long. And it's a good question. I think, as I said earlier, a case against a doctor is tougher to prove. You need more evidence. I know that the authorities looked into a lot more deaths than they ultimately charged him with. I've seen estimates as high as the mid-30s as the number of patients who passed away, and they wound up including 14 names in the indictment. So maybe they were looking for more I can only imagine, and I certainly don't speak for them, maybe they were just waiting to shore up the case. I don't know. But I mean, Randy and the Dispatch headline is memorable. More died as 3-year probe unfolded. I will say, part of the reason I'm saying it's hard to prosecute a doctor like this is at the local level, there was a story after the raid of one of Vulcan's clinics where a local prosecutor was interviewed by the local paper, and they said these cases are really hard to prosecute. And it might have also been hard to get people to cooperate. There was a lot of fear around, people not wanting to name names, that sort of thing. So
no, and I honestly, and I do hear that. I do. And you can't have all the answers for everything, no matter how much research you've done, because we'll still be left feeling like this just doesn't feel right. And it could have maybe been better because there were lives, on the line. It's just like we just recently did something on this nurse who was a baby killer over in England, a notorious baby serial killer. And it took the hospital so long to finally work with authorities on that in the process, more babies were killed.
Well, I can tell you this. There's a lot that I wrote and researched that didn't make it into the book. And I'll share something with you that had to be cut just for space. And I did look into the DEA a bit more than what made it into the book. And there have been a lot of stories by the Washington Post and by others about why the DEA, broadly speaking, was slow to act on this stuff. Among the responsibilities that the DEA has is they determine the annual quotas of any given drug that are allowed to be manufactured. They basically control the levels of how many opiates are going to be produced in a given year. And this report focuses on that specific issue and specifically how even after the opiate epidemic was well underway, when the fires were raging, when people were writing to the DEA, asking them, pleading with them to stop raising those quotas or stop allowing this high level of production, they received those complaints, and they also received similar requests from pharmaceutical companies, and basically listened to the pharmaceutical companies more than the people who were asking for them to stop. And in this report, the West Virginia Attorney General basically says people died as a result of this. So the DEA, while I think they got it right in this case, I do think Dr. Vulgan was a bad doctor who was a danger to the public. There have been some real legitimate questions raised about how aggressive they were during the opiate epidemic and their overall approach to this stuff, including, as I mentioned, by folks in the West Virginia Attorney General's office.
So how did they finally get him? Did they go in undercover? How was he arrested?
There were a lot of, one of the reasons it took me 15 years to finish this, although I was doing some other things during that time, is there were so many different strands to the case. So there were lawsuits, and one of the strands was when the DEA arrested or indicted Vulcan, they also seized his assets. which they claimed were ill-gotten assets from the result of drug dealing. And in that case, there was a document, a 25-page affidavit from a DEA agent, which kind of spelled out how the investigation proceeded. And it started with complaints from pharmacies, and it started with to the DEA. It continued with flags of some kind from the Ohio Pharmacy Board, Medical Board, and then it also talked about interviewing former employees. There was some surveillance of the clinics, watching how many people were coming in and out. And so it was there were a lot of different things that went into it. And there was a patient who cooperated, at least one patient who cooperated with the DEA and put a camera in her purse and recorded her office visit. And that video was later shown in trial, which I have the video of that. I mean, it feels very, I don't know, Dateline-esque. But you watch her, you sit with her in the waiting room for maybe an hour, and you see what the kind of vibe was like. A lot of pretty young folks in their 30s and 40s, kind of walking around, some of them joking around, some with little, kids with them. And then you see her go in and talk to the doctor you see her pay cash and have maybe a 10-minute visit with the doctor. And so that was part of the case against him. During the trial, they brought in a guy from DEA headquarters who had crunched the numbers and showed the jury comparisons of how Volkmann's purchasing and prescribing compared to other doctors locally and statewide and nationally, how basically he dwarfed all of them. He even was out prescribing some local pharmacies. One of the jurors I interviewed told me that basically after that slideshow presentation, her mind was basically made up. It was just so convincing. And they also, at the trial, they called 70 witnesses. A number of them were former patients who talked about their addiction issues, talked about what it was like to see inside the clinic. A number of them, some were former employees. Denise, the clinic owner, and her daughter both testified. And a lot of them were coroners and forensic toxicologists and folks of that sort who testified to the fact that Volkmann had allegedly caused the deaths of these patients through his prescribing. And there were also a handful of medical experts who were the ones who, in a case like this, where the law hinges on the subjective word of legitimate, were these pills prescribed in the course of legitimate medical practice, there were dueling experts on either side of the case. Volkmann called experts who said everything he did was by the book. It was legitimate. He did care for his patients. And the prosecution called a number of experts who said, no way, this was so outside the pale. This was not medicine. This was drug dealing. So it was a case, they used a lot of different methods.
Did he take the stand in his own defense?
He vowed up and down that he would. And then he was apparently convinced by his, Volkmann, I should say, is a man who has an extremely high opinion of himself. No shortage of confidence. But his attorneys, I guess, prevailed on him not to testify. And he didn't testify, though he was furious with them after that for convincing him not to testify, and B, basically during the sentencing hearing, after which he had which was after he had had a falling out with one of his attorneys, he basically tried to testify there, even though the judge told him the time has come and gone for you to deliver your side of the story. The time for that would have been during the trial.
And so no,
he didn't, but he tried later, basically.
He tried. And that's interesting that he would do it at sentencing, because at this point, with a lot of judges, if you don't begin the process of reconciling what you've done, apologize, show remorse, that often can go towards sentencing. So if he's still trying to, explain away.
So imagine all of the things a defendant would do to try to maximize their chances for leniency. He did none of them. To give you an example, at the trial, at the sentencing, he called the judge a heinous criminal.
Yes.
That was among the things he said. He said, "You are the heinous criminal in this room, not me." So he didn't show remorse. He said, "I have no apologies to make." And I think none of these things help. I mean, if you want to look at why did he get 4 consecutive life sentences, why did he receive this astonishingly strict sentence? Some of it had to do with the crimes themselves. Some of it had to do with the fact that this area was so hard hit even before he arrived. Even I found a newspaper clipping from 2003, the year he arrived, from the local paper describing the fact that the town had already earned the nickname the OxyContin capital of the world. So he was walking into an area that was already ravaged. So you have the crimes, you have the location, you have his level of qualification. You have the fact that, as you said, that he kept being raided, kept going back into business. And then you have the fact that he just didn't show any remorse and was actively hostile to the judge. And wound up getting 4.
So he gets 4 consecutive life sentences. So for the rest of his life, this man is never going to see freedom ever. Let me ask you this. He obviously believes that he's innocent.
Yeah.
And have any of his appeals worked? And what's this whole thing that I saw online asking for his compassionate release?
None of his appeals have worked. He basically tried every imaginable way to try to get out of prison, every imaginable legal argument. I mean, he even tried to get the judge, the one whom he had called a heinous criminal, to recuse herself. This was when he was acting as his own lawyer after conviction. He tried to have the proceedings thrown out, that. He tried everything. None of it worked. Then he tried, when COVID came around, an effort to get out on compassionate grounds, basically arguing, I'm old, I'm unwell, the prison is unsafe for me during COVID, please let me out because I meet the extraordinary, the criteria for these narrow criteria for when a person should be released. That didn't work. The fundraiser you might have seen was when his daughter was sympathetic to him, trying to raise money to get a doctor to get a lawyer to help him argue that. I will say, one of the things I found that was interesting and complicated about this case is, if you were to find someone, Vulgan was found liable for 4 patient deaths. And that was part of his conviction. If you were to find someone convicted of murdering 4 people, it's unlikely you would find anyone in the public defending them. And yet, I won't say most people, but there are some pockets of the internet, the medical world, these people who are staunch pain advocates, including this one former pain doctor himself, who has started a website called Doctors of Courage, who are sympathetic to convicted doctors because they believe so strongly that the government has cracked down too hard on these doctors and that it's hard for patients to get the pills they need, and that doctors in Volkmann's position, who were ostensibly providing pills to people who were suffering, are heroic. You will find some pockets of the internet and some people I interviewed who are sympathetic to him. But those people are in a pretty narrow minority. And thus far, none of the arguments that he's marshaled to get himself out of prison have worked.
So what do you make of him? You've met him, you've spoken to him, you've interviewed him.
He's not a very sympathetic guy.
So he's not likable.
No. And he claims he's very, so he's extremely egotistical. He's very smart. Certainly, I wouldn't disagree with that. He's extremely egotistical. He's bitterly angry. And for me, it was since I met him after his indictment, and he believed that he was wrongfully accused, it was, it was hard for me to suss out, well, is this guy, was he an angry guy from the get-go, or is he angry because he thought he was wrongfully convicted? Turns out he's been pretty angry for a while. He's very conspiratorially minded. The longer I knew him, the more kind of flights of fancy and conspiracy theories he was willing to buy into about why he had been convicted. Basically anything that would point anywhere other than him, he was happy to believe. For instance, he alleged that President Obama sent his drug czar to Cincinnati to give a speech about the ills of prescription drug abuse at the time of his trial in order to persuade the jury. Well, it turns out that speech, which wasn't in any way like Vulgan described it, happened after the jury had already been let go. But that's the kind of thing he will claim, that people are out to get him from the very top on down. And, you know, he doesn't have very many kind words to say to anybody. He's pretty much estranged from both of his kids at this point, and didn't have many friends as an adult. So he's a troubled guy, and a guy with a very, very dark worldview. And what you won't hear from him in his version of things, his version is basically, I was a compassionate pain doctor who went out of my way to treat these people in an underserved part of the country who were in desperate pain and needed me because all other doctors were afraid to give them the pills they needed. Well, that story leaves out a lot of stuff, namely his desperation when he got into this line of work. The fact that he was basically unemployable, the fact that he did tell me that for a period of time he was chopping vegetables in a catering kitchen, which for a guy with an MD, PhD and his temperament must have been utterly humiliating and enraging. And here he was trying to keep up this pretty posh lifestyle in Chicago. He was living on North Lakeshore Drive in an apartment with a view of the lake and doormen, and just kind of an upscale lifestyle that he didn't have the means to upkeep when he lost his ability for insurance. So he kind of bypasses all of that stuff when he tells his story and focuses on the tale of his victimization.
Despite his education, you know, he really does not distinguish himself as a criminal. He has a lot of similarities as far as character and as how he sees himself in the world as so many other criminals do. His only difference is he's a highly educated man.
Yes. And I would say also another thing that, you know, another reason it took me so long to work on this was here I am, you know, decades younger than this guy. I don't have an MD and a PhD. How do I tell a story in which I basically call BS on this very intelligent, highly qualified man? This was not something I do lightly, especially knowing that it's going to utterly infuriate him because of. So it took me a long time to feel like the book was as solid as I wanted it to be. And one of the things I talk about in the book was, you know, it's one thing to hear Paul's story when he's telling it to you in Chicago and you're not down in Ohio. But if you go down to Ohio, to this part of the country and this part of the state, which has been just ravaged by prescription drugs, it's really hard to overstate how many of these pill mills they've seen. It's hard to overstate how close people are to this issue. Just about everyone knows someone who's overdosed. Some people know multiple people. People have lost family members. Grandparents are raising their grandkids because the parents have passed away. It becomes so implausible, this tale of the compassionate doctor. And Vulgan was part of this chain of doctors over 20 some odd years in this neck of the woods. There were a lot before him and there were a lot after him who were convicted of similar crimes, working at similar clinics. And so in order to believe him, you don't just have to believe his kind of far-fetched story. You need to believe that he was the one doctor of this chain of convicted doctors in this particularly hard-hit part of the country that was doing the right thing and got a raw deal and was railroaded by the authorities. And I didn't believe it, and I don't believe it.
I'm curious as to what his reaction is going to be about your book. I'm sure you'll be hearing from him I don't think he can keep his lips sealed on
Well,
this one.
so we were talking on and off for about 10 years. And then you mentioned this Cincinnati Magazine article I wrote in 2017, which was really the first time. I had never made any promises to him. I had never said to him, yes, I believe you're innocent. I'm going to write the story of your exoneration. I never said any of that. I always said, I'm a journalist. I'm here to get the truth. To the extent that you can tell me that, I want to talk. But when I published this article, which gave him plenty of space to share his thoughts, but certainly was not the story of a wrongfully accused man, he was predictably infuriated by it and sent me a letter calling me all kinds of names and basically stopped talking to me for a few years. And we only briefly reconnected when I got the book deal and started corresponding again. And then because I wouldn't help him in his efforts to get out of prison by doing research for him, he again stopped talking to me for good at that point. So I don't think he's going to like the book.
Yeah, people don't like to hear the truth about themselves. Wow, this has been just fascinating, Philip. Thank you so much. I have a million questions for you. I'm sure they'll be answered in the book. We wish you much success with the book. I know it's your first book, and that's a very exciting thing for a writer, for a journalist. It's huge. It's a huge accomplishment.
It is. Well, thank you so much for having me. Working for so long on this project all alone, and to have it be on the way out into the world and to have folks like you take interest and want to hear from me and want to tell people about it. It's such a thrill, and I appreciate it so much.
Philip, is there a place where people can follow you for any updates on your book or book tours or anything like that?
Absolutely. So they can always follow me on Twitter @PhilIsle. They can find me on Facebook. They can find me my website, philipisle.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm now on TikTok. I have joined all of the apps in anticipation for this book coming out, which is probably not good for my attention span because now I'm just overwhelmed. But they basically, if they plug my name into Google, they'll find all kinds of ways to get in touch with me.
Terrific. And we'll link to all of that as well. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the program. Again, we wish you much success with this.
Thank you so much.
Of course. You can find this episode wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our website. You can follow everything we do here at True Crime Daily. So until next time, I'm your host, Ana Garcia. And as we always say here on the podcast, don't do crime.